You're watching The Truth About Inflammation by Dr. Alyssa Gall on Resonance Wellness TV, part of our Whole Life Medicine Alleviate series. Keep in the loop about future webinars and events on whole-life-medicine.com. So good evening, everyone, and welcome to The Truth About Inflammation. My name's Dr. Alyssa Gall, and I'll be your host and guide this evening about all things, well, swollen. So once again, tonight's webinar is brought to you as an examination of the first step of the whole life medicine model, which is alleviate. And as we've spoken about before, alleviate is the step where we look at root causes, detoxification, and the potential for missing components that our body needs to heal. Today, we're talking about inflammation. And this is not an easy topic, and it's quite misunderstood. But suffice it to say that there are root causes to inflammation. It is related to detoxification in part, and also often to categories of missing ingredients. So inflammation contributes to most of the diseases of civilization, and of course, this plays into how we can become more problem specific, depending on the particular condition that you have. So let's start by taking a good look at what inflammation actually is. Inflammation is a natural defense response. It's produced by cells in the immune system. And normal inflammation is triggered by injury or infection, typically. And when it's balanced, it helps you ward off infection. It cleans up the mess after an infection. It gets rid of damaged or injured tissue. And it assists in repairing tissues that have been affected by whatever it is that started it all off. The problem is that even though these are the normal responses, so here you can see I've written down inflammatory triggers, so the infection, tissue injury, or tissue stress and malfunction, all of those categories, those three categories can really produce an inflammation, and there's purposes for that inflammation. In the case of an infection, like I'd said before, it's part of your host defense against an infection. When the tissue is injured, it's part of the tissue repair response. And if there's some sort of other kind of tissue stress or malfunction, it can help you to restore a homeostatic state in whatever tissue is being affected. Now, if you do get inflammation, we can recognize the signs of normal inflammation. And these are the 5 cardinal signs of inflammation. They are obviously pain, heat, redness, swelling, and loss of function. So these symptoms of inflammation really normally resolve in a relatively short period of time, regardless of what the cause is. It's usually from days to weeks. But if inflammation is not kept in its normal limits, we start to see pathological consequences to that. And here is again the same chart, but with a few more arrows added. So here when we see that you can have an infection where the host defense maybe gets a bit stuck, what you can start to see is chronic infection. Sometimes autoimmunity gets triggered, inflammatory tissue damage, and sepsis would mean that you completely lose control over infection and it starts to spread out everywhere. There's also the possibility of, if you have a tissue injury that goes through an inflammatory process and that you don't get the full repair, that you can get interesting changes within that tissue that are not a normalization of the original tissue. And in tissue stress and malfunction, instead of going back to a homeostatic state, you start to create autoinflammatory illnesses. So inflammation should be clear that inflammation is both good and bad, and potentially can be really ugly. The good is that inflammation is your body's first line of defense against harm. It's an attempt at self-protection. It begins the healing process, and that is what we would call acute inflammation. The bad is that chronic long-term inflammation can last for a prolonged period, several months to years, and create varying amounts of damage. And the ugly part of it is that it can eventually contribute to several diseases and conditions. So in essence, if you look at what potential conditions you could be talking about, there's a huge list. Some examples would include like asthma, cancer, ischemic heart disease, strokes, chronic kidney disease, obesity, type 2 diabetes, periodontal inflammation, sinus inflammation, autoimmune conditions like rheumatoid arthritis, ulcerative colitis, Crohn's disease, and neurodegenerative illnesses like Alzheimer's disease, like traumatic brain injuries. There's basically elements of inflammation, both on the upswing of those towards that ideally would go towards health, but also in the chronic sense, in the non-resolving phases towards tissue damage and pathology. And so it is a very significant cause of death in the world. The World Health Organization has ranked this as really inflammation as actually the greatest threat to human health, even though we've obviously had some other threats to human health in this past couple of years. Inflammation is a huge one. And it is one of the most important medical discoveries really of the past few decades, that the immune system inflammatory processes are not just involved in a few things, but a huge variety of not just physical, but also mental health problems that's really dominating present day diseases and causes of death worldwide. So the World Health Organization has actually said that more than 50% of all deaths are attributable to inflammation-related diseases, just even those diseases that I've just listed. So obviously, this is a big trouble. So let's start at the beginning and take a look at what potentially might be symptoms of inflammation. Because the interesting thing is that you can be having symptoms of inflammation for quite some time before a pathology appears. So sometimes you'll have to actually look at a list to see like what's possible. We actually can do two things in terms of symptoms. We can actually look at lab tests. There's a handful of those we'll talk about today. And obviously a symptom list. So let's take a look at a symptom list. I tried to jam it all on the same page. So this is an inflammation symptom list. And you can see there's quite a few things here. And if you just roll through it, and I hope it's big enough for everybody to see, because like I said, I'm trying to jam it on this page, but there are inflammatory processes potentially. Now, it doesn't mean if you have this particular symptom that all of it is inflammatory, but chances are good that if you have a number of these, that there's inflammation as a problem in your body. So there's the basic things like headaches, dizziness, insomnia, being faint, itching ears, ringing in your ears, earaches, drainage from your ears, bags or dark circles under your eyes, watery or itchy eyes. You know, you get the idea. There's like a whole range of different things here. I've listed them for noses, mouth, throat, heart, lungs, skin, joints and muscles. Some of the mental emotional symptoms are there as well. Energy level symptoms, weight symptoms, digestive symptoms, and then just some other miscellaneous ones that we're just tacking on here at the end. So it also depends, of course, on how frequently you experience these particular symptoms. If they're there all of the time, it's more likely that there's an inflammatory thing that's going on for you right now. If you see them every once in a while, of course, you can have inflammation for short windows of time where it doesn't really stick. But long term, if you continue to see those things, then you could have a good and high level of inflammation. So if you were to say 1 was occasional and 4 was always, if you can say you have a score of 50 or higher, so that means that you marked a dozen things at 4 or higher, that would be considered a high level of inflammation on this particular questionnaire. And if you're interested in taking this questionnaire, let me know. I will make it available to you in a PDF. So let's also take a look at the potential for doing lab testing. Now, you'd think lab testing, there'd be a lot more lab testing available for inflammation, but there's only some very basic inflammatory tests that are commonly available. The top one is a high sensitivity C-reactive protein. It is a marker that's not specific to a particular disease, but does typically give you a sense of how much inflammation in general there is in the body. And you may have had this test done at some point in your life. Maybe somebody was monitoring your arthritis or your cardiovascular disease, or maybe they were just doing that to rule out a particular disease because you were having an issue with something in your body that was inflamed. It is probably one of the better markers of inflammation, although it's not the only one. And sometimes other old-fashioned markers of inflammation, like an ESR, which is an erythrocyte sedimentation rate, can find it even if high sensitivity CRP doesn't come out positive. And there's a number of tests that you will see depending on the conditions showing up when there's inflammation. Homocysteine levels sometimes elevate. Ferritin levels elevate in inflammation, especially when there's infectious inflammation or chronic inflammation. We can run microbiome labs that show what the relative balance of microbiomes are. And so that's your bacterial mix in your gut. And there are measures of inflammation that often become evident there depending on what populations come out as the most populous. There are intestinal permeability tests that you can take that actually shows that there's inflammation at the gut wall barrier, so that it's actually transferring things it shouldn't be transferring across it. That normally only happens if you have inflammation at the intestinal level. There are autoimmune reactivity labs that you can take, and cross-reactivity labs. These are measures of immune inflammation. They're not as commonly used. A lot of them are more expensive tests that are really helpful if you already know something inflamed going on, but you can't quite figure out what it is. You can also do methylation testing. Methylation has an impact on how good your detoxification processes are. And as a consequence, if you have poor detoxification, it's not unusual to have inflammation from toxicity. You can also see more specific lipid markers like ApoE4 or ApoA2. You might have heard of these before. This is kind of like taking cholesterol testing blood lipids to a better level. You can also test allergies. Allergies are sometimes also responsible for inflammation. So chronic inflammation can be caused by chronic food sensitivities. That isn't necessarily like an anaphylactic allergy, like the classic anaphylactic allergy, but you can get things that are inflaming you subtly, but significantly. So sometimes we have to do a little bit of investigation to figure out why the person is creating inflammation in their body. So there are known risk factors associated with chronic inflammation. Given that the statistics of inflammation is so high, from an alleviate perspective, we really need to take a look at what the risk factors are that drive the increase in dysfunctional inflammation. And I found this most beautiful illustration that was published a couple of years ago that shows the relationship between systemic chronic inflammation production from the triggers into the longer term manifestations. So this is kind of telling you that if there are things that are driving that systemic chronic inflammation, you can actually produce a range of different pathologies that technically you wouldn't think are related to each other. But if you really look at this wheel of triggers, you can see that most of these risk factors are in essence lifestyle factors that are either under our control or they're circumstances that are brought about by human activities in the world or by chemical use in the world. And so this illustration to me really is gathering together a lot of the things that we've talked about on this series in the last 2 years. We've talked about almost all of these categories, and we're going to touch now on how each of these categories has an impact on the production of inflammation. So This is, of course, good news because these things are under our control. That is the good news for the most part. If we actively engage in remedying some of these lifestyle elements, we can reduce or prevent chronic inflammation. So let's go through the cogwheel of the things we can do to improve it. And then I'm going to try and summarize or quote for you recent research in all of these key trigger areas. So let's first talk about xenobiotics. So xenobiotic is the term that's used to describe chemical substances that are foreign to animal life. So such examples are drugs, pesticides, cosmetics, flavorings, artificial flavorings and fragrances, food additives, industrial chemicals and environmental pollutants. It can even be plant constituents. There is a program in the United States that was spearheaded called the Tox 21 program that's tested more than 9,000 chemicals. And it's shown that numerous chemicals that ordinary people are commonly exposed to greatly alter molecular signaling pathways in inflammation and in inflammation-related disease risk. So some just off the top of our heads are the phthalates, the polyfluoroalkyl substances, the bisphenols, the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, the flame retardants. So these are all things that we see in plastics, in additives. I don't know if you caught the environmental toxins in your health webinar last summer, but we talked a lot about how a lot of the commercial products that we're exposed to have a lot of chemicals in them. Sometimes you don't even realize how soaked in chemicals they are. Even children's pajamas and mattresses have to be, by law, coated with flame retardants because they don't want people setting themselves on fire. So one of the most important xenobiotics that contributes to inflammation that you would have control over is if you're smoking. Smoking is a really significant contributor to inflammation, and it's a lifestyle factor that's controllable. It actually also affects the people around you. And in fact, there's a lot of data that shows that children suffer a lot from not just the smoke, but the smoke that coats the walls when people smoke inside of a building. It really aggravates the respiratory systems of small children, and it increases the chances of you getting like RSV, which is respiratory syncytial virus, quite profoundly. And so it's not just affecting the person that's smoking, it's also affecting the inner climate of the building. So worldwide, smoking is literally the single largest preventable cause of disease and premature death. It kills 1 in 10 adults globally. That's a lot. And if current trends continue, by 2030, smoking will kill 1 in 6. Smoking is a prime factor in heart disease, stroke, and chronic lung disease. And the relationship between smoking and cardiovascular disease is well documented because there's an association with smoking with increased levels of inflammatory markers, and that accelerates atherosclerosis. That's where you build up a plaque in the lining of your arteries. It's also well known that if a smoker quits, their risk of dying and their risk of future cardiac events declines. Smoking is actually triggering an immune response to vascular injury. So this is the reason why we see a lot of the symptoms in the vascular system. So you get these increased levels of inflammatory markers, you get the C-reactive protein, you get elevations of the white blood cells making their way to the vascular system. And the more of that that's going on, the more likely it is that you're going to see a future cardiovascular event. So if you're smoking and you want to quit, don't forget to ask me about what you can do. I'm hoping that most of my clients are not smokers anymore. I think just the relative amount of smoking has gone down dramatically in Canada, even in the last 20 years, but worldwide it is still a major problem. But don't be embarrassed. Come and bring it as a problem if you have it. Now, the next thing that has a big impact on inflammation is sleep. Getting restful sleep every night is really essential in combating inflammation. While we sleep, our body performs really key healing and restoration processes. So there are experimental studies on the effect of acute sleep loss in humans that have shown that molecules of inflammation, mediators of inflammation, are altered by sleep loss. So that will occur in a healthy, like rigorously screened individual undergoing just a 24-hour experimental period. And we've also seen, in response to various durations of sleep restrictions, if you take them, like if you decrease your sleep to 25 to 50% of the normal 8 hours sleep amount, even with those small changes, you'll get subclinical shifts in inflammatory cytokines that are known to be associated with metabolic syndrome, even in healthy asymptomatic individuals. So although the mechanism of that is in humans is not really known, like how exactly the lack of sleep translates into the altered inflammatory status isn't known. It's quite likely that it's your stress system that's activating, so autonomic nervous system activation, and then the metabolic changes that are playing the key roles. So the average healthy adult needs 7 to 9 hours of sleep each night. And remember that we did a whole webinar last year about sleep. It was called Sleep 101. So if sleep is part of the things that are going on with you, please make sure to go back and watch that for ideas about how you can improve that factor in inflammation. This is going to be a crazy review of this entire year. Now, the next thing, isolation and chronic stress. Well, what are we in the middle of at this moment? I think isolation and chronic stress. So too much stress contributes a great deal to inflammation. And it's because homeostatic imbalance is really provoked anytime there's a psychological, environmental, or physical stressor. And events that are stressful cause neurochemical changes, neurotransmitter changes, hormonal alterations, because you're activating the fight or flight system, that sympathetic nervous system, and the HPA axis, also known as the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. And that's the connection between the brains and the stress glands. So when stress stimuli are under control, the body responds in a physiological way. So you get that sympathetic nervous system activation and the HPA axis woken up to release chemical mediators that protect your body from stress. So like as an example, adrenaline becomes elevated. It increases your heart rate and your blood pressure. It helps you to fight or escape. And that's a totally appropriate body reaction. It's really beneficial to our survival and recovery, especially if we're being chased by something. However, if stress stimuli are really prolonged or over-exaggerated, you start to see abnormal physical states. And in the last 2 decades, there's accumulating evidence that indicates that severe or prolonged stress results in an increased risk for physical and psychiatric disorders. And generally, it's lumped into a category that's called stress-related disease. So stress is a common risk factor of 75 to 90% of diseases. That includes the diseases that cause the most morbidity and mortality. So the most number of cases of disease and the most number of deaths. So obviously these are the cardiovascular diseases, the metabolic diseases like diabetes and non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. Psychotic and neurodegenerative disorders are in this category, and cancer is in this category. So there's evidence that exposure to psychological stress early in life, so as an example, in the form of abuse or neglect or maltreatment, bullying, living in a low socioeconomic condition, can heighten neural responses to threat, and that can upregulate inflammatory activity, alter how effective the immune system is, and lead to subacute chronic inflammation, basically throughout the life cycle. Now, not everybody who experiences early stress is going to translate it like that, just so you're aware. There are people who, in some cases, quite mysteriously, are substantially more resilient than others. And so it doesn't stand to reason that every single person is going to suffer this way, but the average person probably does. And guess what? We did a whole webinar on adaptogens just last year where I explained stress and how to mitigate it with herbal supports for stress called adaptogens. And we also did a whole webinar on using medicinal mushrooms for improving stressful responses. So again, if there's a set of things here in terms of stress, and you realize, gosh, stress is probably my biggest thing going right now, then what you can do to prevent inflammation now and in the future is literally in that couple of hours of webinars from last year. It's like a theme here, aren't we seeing? It's very interesting. We're starting to see things come together. And if you're just starting to join us after a couple of years worth of webinars, then there's lots for you to go back and take a look at that you missed. But one of the most amazing things that came out of doing this webinar for me was seeing how related all of these things are when it really comes down to the basics of inflammation. Now, next, the question that everybody always asks me is about inflammation and diet. So obviously, one of the best ways to reduce inflammation can lie in what you're eating. And we could totally talk all night about just this topic. And the main question in your mind really should be, why is it that diet contributes to inflammation? And I think there's some relatively simple answers to that, and there's potentially some slightly more complex answers to that, which we can cogitate about here a little bit. So industrial improvements in the world have actually changed things a lot. You know, obviously the positives of that, the benefits of that are social stability. We tend to not be physically as traumatized. We have access to continuously improving medical technology systems. We have better public health measures, in particular sanitation. All of that significantly changes the environment that we're in. However, more recently, those same changes also cause radical shifts in diet and lifestyle. And they do really result in living circumstances that are very different from the ones that shaped human physiology for probably most of its existence. And this is believed to have created an evolutionary mismatch in humans. So that's characterized by an increasing separation from what their ecological niche really is. And this mismatch, in turn, has really been hypothesized to be a major cause of subacute chronic inflammation. So in essence, what this study is talking about is that the modern diets don't really resemble original human diets. And it's funny, I was just talking to a patient about this earlier today because, you know, as most of you probably know, this is a little bit of a pet research topic of mine. I love to know, what did people eat and when did things start changing? And if you caught the sugar webinar last month, we talked about, isn't it amazing that the production of sugar and how it gets incorporated in the diet has really shifted things for Western, especially Western industrialized countries, and, you know, slowly but surely in all countries of the world, because all countries kind of seem to go through very similar phases of industrialization and degradation of food systems, unfortunately. And, you know, there's several other nutritional factors that are promoting inflammation and potentially contributing, but those kinds of major mismatches between who you are and historically what people have eaten in the places where your genetic background comes from, I think they're exceptionally important. If you look at nutrients, you can see deficiencies in micronutrients in lots of people with inflammation. Things like zinc and magnesium are commonly go missing in processed diets. So if you are eating refined foods, you're basically losing vitamin and mineral content. They often have suboptimal, like omega-3 levels in those kinds of foods. And that really actually has an impact on the resolution phase of inflammation. So your big omega-3 fatty acids, so the ones that you're getting out of fish and flax and multiple other things on the planet, they actually modulate the expression of genes involved in metabolism and inflammation. And more importantly, they're actually precursors to a subset of molecules that are involved in the resolution of inflammation. So if any of you have ever used from the clinic SPM Active, this is actually a subset of resolving essential fatty acid factors. And if you have inflammation that's chronic, we need to put those types of compounds in a lot, a fairly good amount, in order to turn the corner between that kind of rolling ball down the hill of chronic inflammation, to actually turn it around enough and push it back into the resolution phase. Because remember, I showed you in the very beginning, I showed you that flow chart where it's supposed to, you're supposed to healthfully have an inflammation reaction, but then you're supposed to back off and go back the other direction. And that's in essence what needs to happen even in a chronic inflammation. So as an example, if I have somebody who has chronic sinus illness and it's been inflamed for years, and then we suddenly manage to get a sinus infection, that is brilliant. That's exactly what we want to see, because an acute response to infection is a raising up of the inflammation back into a normal range where it has the potential to resolve. So obviously, omega-3 fatty acid supplementation in some people reduces inflammation, although I think it does work better to do it with food. Almost everything seems to work better doing with food, in all honesty, because I know people are going to ask me, okay, what are the top supplements I can take to reduce inflammation? That is actually a very expensive, low efficacy way of doing many things. So if you can manage to go back and take a look at some of these sources of inflammation and change it where you have your weak points, it's way more bang for buck and effort. So we've talked repeatedly about how to eat. And like I said, we talked about sugar and how sweeteners have made such an impact. We also did a more detailed talk about metabolism in the metabolic reset presentation. And that was talking about how to create your best diet from self-assessment and lab data. So suffice it to say that diets of fresh food that are minimally processed are really key. And you've probably seen me show you the diagram of what does the ideal dinner plate look like. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, then you can go back and take a look at some of those presentations, and you'll see that epidemiologically, the healthiest diet is to have a half plate of non-starchy vegetables, less than a quarter of meats and fats, less than an eighth probably of grains. Can't remember exactly what the percentage is on my chart right now. I can just remember the picture. And then seafoods and salt, seaweeds and salt, about 1%, and fermented foods, a little window as well. So go back and take a look at some of that. But really the take-home message is we have to think about how do we modify our diets to just be as healthy as we can get it within the context, not just of our dinner plate, but also our own metabolic histories. So another thing that we did talk about last year was the microbiome. I hope you guys had the chance to see that as well. And we talked about how changes in the bacterial environment of the gut can create some really interesting conditions. It is a very large contributor to inflammatory processes if there are big changes in the bacterial environment of the gut. And the typical diets that have really become widely adopted are relatively low in fruits, vegetables, and those fiber and prebiotic rich foods. They're high in refined grains, they're high in alcohol, and in ultra processed foods. And they even have things like emulsifiers. That's, they're all things that don't really exist in nature. So these dietary factors really alter the gut microbiota composition. They change function. They're linked to increased intestinal permeability, like we talked about the potential for lab testing that. And they cause epigenetic changes in the immune system. There are low-grade endotoxemias and subacute inflammation literally coming out of the potential for changes in the microbiome. So bacterial populations change in response to you eating weird things. You eat foods that don't exist on the planet, And there will be some bacteria usually in there that will attempt to make the best of things, but you would literally change your bacteria towards populations of bugs that really can tolerate what you're putting down there. So if you can't pick the thing that you're eating off the ground easily, rethink it where you can. I make a personal exception for licorice. The real licorice, of course, the one made out of like botanicals, but it is, I'm pretty sure you can't find licorice on the ground. I'll just admit that right up front. But in the larger scheme of things, joking aside, if you can find ways to not alter your gut microbiota, it will prevent you from an increased fat mass. It'll prevent pro-inflammatory biomarkers. It'll prevent insulin resistance. And if you can figure out what your triggers of dysbiosis and intestinal hyperpermeability is, I mean, there's a bunch of them that are kind of standard, like overuse of antibiotics, using a lot of non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs like Tylenol and aspirins, using proton pump inhibitors, so the Zantac and the Prilosec of the world. You know, that is literally the most used over-the-counter prescription sets of items in the world, the proton pump inhibitors. That's how many people have poor stomach function. And they completely change your downstream digestion. Now, nobody keels over directly from taking a proton pump inhibitor, you know, and if you're really symptomatic heartburn-wise, people like taking those because they don't feel the pain, but they have huge consequences. And we did an entire webinar on digestion last year, I think, as well, or maybe even the year before now, where we went and looked through all of the sequencing of how do you create a great digestive response so that you don't put yourself into these particular categories. Even, you know, people not being exposed to microorganisms as much, you know, like right now, of course, we're hand sanitizing the living daylights out of our skin ecosystems. And some of those are pretty potent, you know, they kill stuff on your hands. I mean, of course, that is the point, but you also have a normal flora and they can be quite damaging to your skin. You know, this kind of thought that all bacteria are bad and that getting a bacteria is the equivalent of getting an infection. We really have to rethink that. It's causing us to make some interesting decisions that are having an impact on our microbiomes. So I want you to think about that. Now, the next thing is looking at obesity. Now, I've put a little diagram here on the side to make a delineation between belly fat and subcutaneous fat. So subcutaneous fat is the stuff that you can kind of grab and wiggle in front of your muscle wall. So, you know, it's like that layer of skin that has a little bits of stuff in it underneath. That's your normal subcutaneous fat layer. But under your abdominal muscles can be something known as visceral fat or belly fat. And excessive visceral adipose tissue, it's known as VAT or VAT, is a really significant trigger of inflammation. So belly fat is basically an organ. It's an active hormonal, immune, and metabolic organ. And there's lots of different kinds of cells in there. I mean, obviously, it's composed of fat cells, but there are immune cells in there that are residents. You have a little bit of circulation, but basically, visceral adipose tissue gets bigger when fat is put into storage in fat cells. And if the visceral fat gets big enough, you can actually create really poor oxygen conditions in it. And so you start to actually kill off fat cells, which jokingly, many people have asked me to help them do. But when you actually damage a cell to death, it induces that normal protective mechanism. So all of a sudden you're secreting all these pro-inflammatory molecules, you get all this migration of more immune cells into the belly fat, and then it really amplifies inflammation. And it's trying to attempt to repair that damaged tissue. It's like literally like you have a glob of fat that you can't maintain at that size even. And so that process eventually just becomes like a prolonged systemic inflammation in some individuals. So if you're having a ton of belly fat problems, this is something that's going on in the background. So this is the hard fat. So when you press your belly, if you feel hardness under there, that's telling you there's fat starting to surround your organs, and it'll surround your heart and your guts. I don't know if you ever remember, like 7th grade is when this happened for me. We dissected a frog, and there were all these fat bodies in the abdomen. And I really remember that. I don't know why I remember that. I'm not really sure why these lab frogs had so many fat bodies. They must have fed them some really bad food. That's what I'm thinking. But they were just wound all the way around the viscera. And I kind of picture it like that in a human being as well. So, and you have to have a little bit of that, of course. You need some fat to store fat-soluble minerals and other fat-soluble vitamins and other compounds. You need those things. However, when it starts to get so big that it operates as its own organ, that's when we have trouble. So if you have enough of that going on, those signaling molecules that are in there also induce insulin resistance. And lots of people have heard of that, insulin resistance. That means you're basically creating a set of conditions where you're spilling lipids into other organs because you're not processing fuels properly. So you inundate the pancreas and the liver. So you see beta cell dysfunction. So that's basically creating insulin resistance. And you're seeing fatty liver. So lots of people have been told they have fatty liver disease after their normal screening labs. So you're basically accelerating aging. You're increasing cardiometabolic risks, neurodegenerative risks, autoimmune diseases. Lots of different types of cancer are associated with that. And they often first emerge during childhood. We'll see this start when a child has this kind of fat, not just under the skin, but deep in the abdomen. And it's probably creating a lot of the increase in inflammatory diseases as the decades pass, because our kids are now fatter than ever. Next risk factor is physical inactivity. So exercise is an essential step in reducing inflammation. So there was one study that showed that worldwide, 31% of individuals are considered physically inactive. That means they don't even meet the minimum international recommendations for regular physical activity. And of course, levels of inactivity are higher in high-income countries than the low to middle-income countries. 48% of Canadians aged 12 and over are inactive in this way. So worldwide, it's 31%. In Canada, it's 48. So that's 12.5 million people inactive. How many people have we got? We probably have more people than that. Isn't it 30 million plus that we have now? It's a huge number. So they're getting literally the equivalent of less than a half hour of walking every day. And that's according to Stats Can research. And 25% of Canadians basically say they sit most of the day. So skeletal muscle is an endocrine organ. It's producing and releasing cytokines and a whole bunch of other small proteins that are called myokines into the bloodstream. And this really happens during muscle contraction. And those molecules systemically reduce inflammation. So if you have low physical activity, you basically have increased inflammation because you're not constantly engaging that part of your physiology. So again, what are you going to do when you see that if you look at the research, low exercise equals increasing inflammation-related disease state, and it's been put together with insulin resistance, altered blood fats, the cardiovascular vessel dysfunction, high blood pressure, losing muscle mass. So as people get older and they don't move, you lose muscle mass. And then you are flipping your risks around, right? Because you don't have enough muscle to actually produce these molecules even to continue to decrease your inflammation. It has an impact on type 2 diabetes, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, osteoporosis, cancer, depression, different kinds of dementia, including Alzheimer's. Basically, anybody who's chronically inactive increases their risk of all those things. Basically, any kind of age-related disease that you can possibly find. But if you go from physically inactive to achieving that kind of recommended moderate intensity aerobic activity, you can decrease your cardiovascular risk by like 23% in, probably a few years. So you have to be doing it consistently. But even when they followed people for like over a decade, they found that they would decrease even like diabetes risk by 26% if people were actually getting 150 minutes per week of some kind of moderate intensity aerobic activity. That is not a lot of commitment, I think. That's 20 minutes a day, probably. So if you look at long study, you like long-term studies, you see the exact same things. Like if you meet the minimum international physical activity recommendations, you will decrease your risk of Alzheimer's by 40%. So there's no supplement on the planet that can do that at all. This has also become very well known in the cancer community. You can increase your cancer survivorship by exercise. This is really marked in breast cancer studies. We've seen a lot of studies show this in breast cancer. You could literally improve your survival rate just by getting off your butt. Isn't that amazing? So if you can find the time, try, 4 or 5 times a week to go out for half an hour to 45 minutes, or do a little bit of weight or resistance training. And don't kill yourself doing it, because if you do go out there and do it at the maximum that you could possibly do and knock yourself out, you actually are going to increase some amount of inflammation, just so you know. And I've had patients who are just gunning it and wondering, why isn't this like producing all these wonderful benefits? But they're just exhausting themselves by the effort. So don't kill yourself doing it. Pick things you like doing and do those things to the point where you feel energized and not depleted. Now, another category here is the category of chronic infections. So there's evidence that chronic infections contribute to inflammation. It is a bit more controversial because some of the infections that we see, or technically call chronic infections, there's not a lot known about why people produce a chronic infection and how that is really translating into inflammation. And I'll give you the examples of Epstein-Barr virus, cytomegalovirus, hepatitis C virus. That's a chronic kind of liver virus. There's a number of different infectious agents that we know people can carry. They seem to have varying impacts on chronic inflammation. So like in terms of aging, as an example, a chronic infection with cytomegalovirus has been associated with early mortality in quite a few longitudinal studies. It's kind of like the same as chronic infection with HIV. You're getting this premature aging of the immune system. And there are associated cardiovascular and skeletal changes with HIV long-term. And the thought is that that's coming from the infected T cells. So you just get these CD8 plus cells that just are producing increased levels of pro-inflammatory molecules. So there has been some preliminary studies that show that the chronic infections could be related to certain cancers, neurodegenerative diseases, cardiovascular disease. It's probably that the chronic infections have some of their relationship with other environmental or genetic factors. It's not as direct as you might think it is, but there's definitely a component here. So, obviously humans co-evolved with a lot of viruses and bacteria and microbes. And so while those chronic infections seem to be contributing to that chronic inflammation, they're not the primary driver. But say, as an example, you have a handful of those other problems that we're listing on that big chart, chances are good that adding chronic infections to that list is probably not the best case scenario. So if you look at like populations of non-industrial societies, like there's the hunter-gatherers of Ecuador, the Ecuadorian Amazon, or there's a set of horticultural forager tribes in Bolivia. There's some hunter-gatherers from Tanzania. There's some subsistence agriculture populations in rural Ghana. There's another similar population in Papua New Guinea. All of those people are minimally exposed to industrialized environments, but they're exposed to a lot of microbes. But they exhibit really low rates of inflammation-related chronic disease. Now, this is not just, of course, infections. They're also eating traditional diets. They're also exercising. But what's interesting is you don't see chronic infections in those people. So the thought is that by itself, it wouldn't be the whole of the inflammation, but it is certainly going to be a contributor and maybe it's also maybe a symptom of dysregulated immunity and inflammation in a population. So this is what I'd like to propose. That everybody go back and take a look at all those factors for yourselves and decide if you are feeling that there's inflammation, that potentially there might be some of those categories that you could do something about. Because as I mentioned before, there's really no set of anti-inflammatory supplements that you can take that's going to reverse all of that to that extent. If there were, you would be hearing about it. And there are things that improve inflammation. Don't get me wrong. There's good data on some great anti-inflammatory plants, turmeric extracts, obviously, there's, cat's claw, there's all sorts of nutrients that'll improve it. You can use the pro-resolving mediators, but at the end of the day, if you don't take care of the lifestyle factors, you'll really struggle to completely eliminate the inflammatory components. So I hope that is mildly, at least, inspiring to go back and take a look at about those old webinars that we did in the last 2 years. I think we can just generally conclude that lifestyle changes are really key to making you healthier now and definitely in the future. And if you've never done this before, you can always go back and take the Start Here, Start Now training. I'm sure at least a handful of you have been through this training, but this is the Crucial Tips for Smart Patients course that we did that had, I think it was at least a dozen, it might be closer to 20 lectures where we talked about all the different lifestyle factors that you could do in more detail. I'm just going to put the link to that up if you haven't had the chance to ever look at that. I think we had a great time in that class, and we certainly, it's certainly a great way of learning if there's other ways that you could potentially improve your lifestyle understanding. And then, of course, don't forget, we have 3 more planned webinars. So we have Brain Health next at the end of March. And then we have the Science Behind Happiness in April. And then in May, we had to replant anti-aging secrets there. We've had some difficulties with the registration. And apparently we're still having difficulties with the registration. So don't get too excited if something doesn't work out with the May one. I will figure out what's wrong with it, hopefully, in the next little while. So if you would like the questionnaire on inflammation, I will certainly send it to you. Good recipe books for anti-inflammatory diet. Deborah, that really depends on who you are. I think the best, the best is looking at what is the balance on your plate. You can almost eat anything out of the natural world as long as you get that balance right on your plate. So I don't know if you remember that, again, that graphic that was like the half non-starchy vegetables and the like 15% starchy vegetables. That is probably one of the most important things you could do. If you just eat like that by itself, that'll be anti-inflammatory. I guarantee it. Almost doesn't matter what you stick in the holes as long as it's something that comes off the planet. So, if you know your metabolic type, if you actually follow your metabolic typing diet, you will come very close to meeting your anti-inflammatory needs. And everybody is a little bit different in that. But that is how I would control somebody who has massive inflammation. We go back, we take a look at what should you be eating, we change the diet, and we can have a marked effect on inflammation in not too much time. Depending on, of course, how motivated people are to achieve that in that time window.
Thanks for watching. I love to connect to my patient community to inform and inspire, and I hope you'll join us again in the near future. Don't forget to check out whole-life-medicine.com for more webinars and events.